Remember the vehicular combat genre? It was popular in the 90s and early aughts, but has since basically disappeared. It was a type of game where you drive around vehicles and enter combat. Top 10 Co-op Vehicle Combat Games. Twisted Metal is probably the main series that comes to mind when talking about vehicle combat games, and you really can't go wrong with any game in the genre. But my personal favorite has always been the sequel. The main advantage Twisted Metal 2 had over the first game is the addition of split-screen co-op gameplay. When I think of the original PlayStation, Twisted Metal is definitely one of the main series that comes to my mind. I have a lot of nostalgia associated with these games, and I've played the entire series. Twisted Metal Black is also one of my favorites, and the reboot that came out on PS3 is great as well. But I think Twisted Metal 2 tops the list for me. And then we have Rogue Trip Vacation 2012. It was a game developed by SingleTrack, the same team that brought us Twisted Metal. The game was mostly met with positive reviews, despite the constant comparisons to Twisted Metal. It is very similar to that series, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. The game is set in the distant future of the year 2012 and has all of the vehicle combat standards you would expect. It has familiar power-ups and objectives that require you to eliminate the computer players. The campaign can be played in split-screen co-op. This is one I did not know about until recently, and I'm glad I found it. If you like Twisted Metal, you're definitely gonna like this one. Critical Depth is another game developed by SingleTrack, and it's also very similar to Twisted Metal. But what differentiates this one is the combat takes place underwater, and all the vehicles are submarines. And instead of just eliminating all the enemies, the main objective revolves around recovering the 4 pods found in each level to open a slip gate to the next level.
At least play the game for this amazing intro cutscene.
What the hell is that?
You tell me.
Can you back up a bit, McCragen? Let's get a better look.
Yeah, hold on. Wait, something...
What's going on down there? McCragen! McCragen!
They just don't make them like this anymore.
Overall, it's another solid game from SingleTrack in the vehicle combat genre. It just really doesn't do anything new. But if you're a fan of the other games mentioned, that should not be a problem. This one is definitely worth seeking out, and it's probably overshadowed by some of the other games.
Also, as you may be able to tell from footage here, player 2 was my 6-year-old daughter, and she was definitely struggling with the controls here, so, don't pay too much attention to that.
The Vigilante 8 games are also very popular in the vehicle combat genre. Yeah, they might be a Twisted Metal ripoff, but the gameplay is solid enough to stand on its own. That being said, it doesn't really have the same memorable characters and story, but that's okay. It doesn't need it. Vigilante 8 Second Offense is pretty much more of what the original had to offer, but it's just a little bit more refined. I love the Dreamcast version. That's the one that I played the most. And like all the other games, you could play it in split-screen co-op. And it has the same arena-based combat, where you just eliminate all the enemies. Another game in the Vigilante 8 series that I wanted to mention, just simply because it's kind of odd. I'm talking about the Game Boy Color Vigilante 8. This one is very different from the other games, as it's a 2D game from an isometric perspective. The main concept remains intact. You choose your vehicle, team up with a friend, take on the enemies. The controls are kind of weird and take a bit to get used to here. It's not the best, it's just cool that this exists. You will need 2 Game Boy Colors and 2 copies of the game, as well as a link cable. No one talks about this one, and it's definitely worth trying out.
Amok is a 1996 mech-themed action game that came out on the Sega Saturn as well as the PC. It's kind of like a mix between Mech Assault and Twisted Metal, The gameplay is pretty similar to a vehicle combat type of game, and you can play it in split-screen co-op. Each level you have different objectives, and I like that between levels your mech changes forms. So sometimes it's like a submarine swimming around underwater, and then other times your mech has legs and you are running around on the ground, kind of like the walker in Star Fox. The graphics are really solid for the time. 3D graphics were not always the Sega Saturn's strong suit, but looking here, it pulls it off really well. There's also a split-screen deathmatch mode. When talking about co-op Sega Saturn games, Amok is definitely not one that gets mentioned very often, so I wanted to bring some light to it.
Starsky and Hutch came out in 2003 on PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. This one is really unique. One player controls Starsky as he drives the car, while another controls Hutch as he shoots enemies and obstacles. The coolest thing is that you can do this while using steering wheel and light gun peripherals. So if you're able to play this game like that, that's the recommended way of doing it. Each level requires you to complete various objectives that often lead to high-speed car chases. This one didn't get great reviews at the time, but looking back at it, I think it's a lot better than its reputation, especially when playing co-op with a light gun. Give this one a try. Bimini Run came out exclusively for the Sega Genesis in 1990, and it's the oldest game on our list. It's a third-person shooter where you drive around in a speedboat. One player controls the boat, the other player does the shooting. The gameplay involves completing objectives and shooting down enemy boats. It's pretty straightforward, but navigating the seas can be kind of a pain in the ass, as everything looks the same. It's easy to get turned around or lost. Luckily, you can pull up a map to show where your targets are. I think this game was ahead of its time, and it just never gets the attention it deserves, especially as a unique co-op experience. Battletanx Global Assault came out on the N64, and it's similar to Twisted Metal and Vigilante 8, but with tanks. This is a sequel to the original game, just titled Battletanx. The update here is the ability to play the campaign in co-op. You and a friend team up in split screen and defeat all of the enemies in the arena, just like most of these games. This one didn't add anything new to the genre really, but it does it really well, and it is often overlooked. It's definitely one of the best co-op games on the N64. Crimewave came out exclusively for the Sega Saturn in 1996. The game takes an isometric overhead view, with the cars being pre-rendered sprites, but the buildings and scenery are rendered in 3D. This perspective definitely helps it stand out from the crowd, but it can be hard to control at times. Like most of these games, you have enemies that you must destroy. Luckily, you get an arrow that points to the direction of your next opponent, so at least you won't have to wander around too much. You can split up the duties and play the game in split-screen co-op. From what I understand, the PAL version has some performance issues in 2-player, so just play the US version. This one isn't perfect, but it's still a co-op game that is often overlooked, so it's definitely a hidden gem on the Sega Saturn. Lucky and Wild is one of the coolest arcade cabinets to come out of the 90s. 2 players sit down, with one driving, with their left hand on the wheel and their right hand on a gun, while the second player takes the other gun. It looks ridiculous, but it's really fun. It's basically your standard light gun shooter, but you get the added task of driving, which definitely adds some much needed depth to the genre. I love the visuals here. There's tons of explosions and bodies just flying all over the place. It's also cool to see your character's facial expressions react to the action. You can always see them in the rear view mirror, and I think that was pretty creative for the time. I definitely recommend this one, especially if you can find the arcade in the wild. It's a really unique experience, and truly just one of my favorite co-op arcade games ever. So there are 10 co-op vehicle combat games. What games did we miss? And if you enjoyed this video, check out our video where we talked about bad co-op games that I like for some reason. And thanks for watching.